I can get my glasses not to fog up, and other times I can.
If you wore the same mask in the car, let us know. And no sign. Goodness. See you there. There was nobody there but me and one other lady. Then I'm worried about Lex.
I have one like this.
It has to be right. So I mean, you don't have that.
Agreed.
It's crazy.
It's a rheumatoid.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. Got diagnosed when she was 13.
Because of me, changed your mind. I think it was just me you would have. It was really bad already.
Raquel, are you running this?
Oh, yeah.
So she's on a bunch of drugs. And gets infusion, and we go to James and Gainesville.
Oh,
But, and hers is just, it's been hard to get under control.
yeah.
So, yeah.
Oh, wait, you sent it to us digitally, didn't you?
I did, but I have a paper one,
Hey ladies,
if you prefer. Paper.
how are you all?
Hey, I haven't had a chance to tune in. How's your show been
Okay.
going?
It's good. We've been talking a lot about food.
Oh, I keep meaning to log in, and every time it's like 10 o'clock.
Today Grady Judd talked for like 20 minutes. We didn't know he was calling in today. He usually calls in like, I guess, once a month or twice a month. And I
Oh.
guess he was supposed to call in last week and he didn't, so he called in this week and he like completely threw off the program. We have like an order of how we go, and he talked for 20 minutes.
Yeah, he likes to.
He's like, well, it's the sheriff.
He said, what are you gonna do, arrest me? Tough one. I
He does
am, if
like
you'll-
to hear himself talk.
I'm going to, no comment. I'm going to pull up the chat for the
Oh.
stream. I'm
Do
gonna
you
try.
want, do you want me to do that today?
I'm good. I'm just gonna
You
kind of
have
keep an eye
to?
on it. I think if
Well,
I
this
if I
here
find
today.
myself not able, I might ask you.
He
to.
has a meeting with, who's he have a meeting with?
I thought he was gonna be here.
A World Churches, something?
Yeah, World
Churches?
Council of, it's like the,
Churches.
I think the Illuminati. I don't know.
Yeah. World Council of Churches?
They're gonna decide what kind of weather we have this year. Yeah, World Council of Churches sounds right. Like, he's talking about, he explained it to me, and I was halfway listening. Something about ecumenism.
What was it? How do the feed go?
All this is currently streaming and recording.
Yeah. Something to do, like he's like talking about kind of something about anti-racism and just kind of how churches can engage that and should engage that in a way that's faithful. Sounded really interesting. This my fuzzy recollection of it belies how interesting I found it. What he was talking about. So the good news is that we have a study guide that's brief. Next week we're covering 4 chapters, so this will be the one where we kind of take our time maybe a little bit. And next week it's just going to be we're going to be going through it. So, but why don't we pray and then we can dive in, and let's do that. Father, we bless you. We're grateful for this time. I'm grateful for these people, Lord. I'm grateful for your word. I pray that you bless this reading, this study, God. I pray that you illuminate within these words ways that we can live faithfully in such times. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So, I'm kind of, so this chapter kind of situates, and Robbie can explain this way better than I can. Robbie's gonna be able to say everything way better than I can. So this is a bit of a downgrade for you all. Apologies, because I'm not a Bible scholar, and Robbie.
Great.
What's that?
You do great. Don't
thanks.
underestimate what you do.
No, thanks, I appreciate that. And then this is obviously Robbie's forte, so, but the way that he kind of explains it, and it makes a lot of sense, this chapter is kind of, last week we kind of found a sort of finale, right? Like the story kind of has a conclusion. And then chapter 12 is almost like this weird little interlude that happens, right? Like this with this dragon story. And then things kind of start to parallel the previous chapters, so chapters like 1 through 11 in reverse order. There's, bowls and angels, and it's almost like a reversal of what had happened up until now. I'm sure if I had my dry erase board and we actually took the time to map it out, it'd be very interesting, but I'm not going to do that. So-
Actually, can I just say one thing?
Yeah.
So, interestingly enough, in playwriting, this is what you put at the end of the first act to get people to come back after intermission. So you have the first act that finishes, and then you have this part that goes, oh, I gotta come back.
Yeah.
And then the second act usually does mirror the first act, so.
There you go. Yeah, I think I don't know if in television, I think they call it a stinger. Like it's like a little, it's the act break that happens like in like old 90s television, like some kind of reveal or dramatic thing happens right before it cuts to commercial. And you get that like, and Saved by the Bell, that and then like, then okay, well I gotta sit through the commercials because I want to see what happens next. It's kind of like that. But it's sort of, well, let's read it. But actually, before we read it, I'm kind of curious to hear what you all have kind of thought about what we've covered so far. Like, we've kind of gone through it at a blistering pace. And since this seems to be kind of a interlude and a zooming out of the grand story, let's do that amongst ourselves. Like, let's pause and let's kind of zoom out a little bit. Like, I trust that those of us for whom Revelation is confusing, maybe we've found a little good clarity. And maybe even for those of us who have had a lot of clarity, maybe this has given us a little confusion, a little good confusion on it, But what do you all think? Like what has stood out to you? Have you really kind of landed on anything or had any kind of epiphanies, theophanies, Christophanies?
Last week, you just over my head, I just had to make sense to me at all.
It's confusing, yeah. No, yes. Yeah, I'm with you. It's all very confusing. Yeah. You're just saying me too.
I'm waving to Delma.
Oh, hey, Delma. Why aren't I seeing that? Are you seeing messages?
My text message.
Oh, okay. Hey, Delma. Sorry, I thought you were seeing the chat.
Sorry.
Hi, Delma. And yeah, if you're watching live, chime in. I've got Jessica's here. Hi, I'm here. Hi, Jessica. Yeah. Anyone got anything? Has anyone heard anything new? Maybe we'll start there.
I had 2 witnesses last week. I had heard like every interpretation except for the Christ and like Jesus in the church. And I was like, oh, I bought into every other interpretation. I'll buy into this one too. So I was digging it. We were talking about it on the way home.
Yeah, that's good.
I think it's just more clarity, like reading, because it's so fantastical that you can read it and it doesn't make sense, and if you don't know a lot of the stuff behind it, then it sounds really fantastical. Like, you know what I mean? Like it's, so I think just taking it, like it seems like it's fast, but I mean, to take an hour to dive into a chapter isn't, I mean, unless I'm getting all my study stuff out, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's not one that you can kind of relate to when you read an Old Testament story and you can pick things out, and some of those you've heard before, but this is always one that's kind of, you don't get into it unless you're in a study or something, because what am I gonna know on my own? Like, to read it and does that make sense?
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
So, I think it's just made it less mystical and a little bit more like, okay, like, this makes sense, like, taking the time to break it down. And
Yeah, that's good. Anyone else, any thoughts, feelings, observations? Cool, let's read. Chapter 12, verse 1. A great portent appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pangs, in the agony of giving birth. Then another portent appeared in heaven, a great red dragon, with 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems on his heads. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to earth. Then the dragon stood before the woman who was about to bear a child, so that he might devour her child as soon as it was born. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was snatched away and taken to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, so that there she can be nourished for 1,260 days. What clues does John give us as to the identity of the woman's child?
She has
Yeah,
a crown
rules.
with 12 stars, which I think are the 12 tribes of Israel. So I think the woman is Israel, the baby is Jesus, and the dragon is Satan.
Sounds good to me. What other clues there are to the identity of the child? He's male, Leslie says.
Right.
That's great.
He rule all nations.
Yep, he's a ruler of nations with a rod of iron.
Taken to God's throne.
Yeah, taken to God's throne. The dragon seeking to devour him. So obviously he's important to the dragon at least. And as a ruler of nations, important to the nations too. Yeah, I think that's right. The second question here: how might we interpret the significance of this celestial woman? I think 12. Yeah, 12 is a significant number. The 12 tribes of Israel. That's usually a safe bet when you see the number 12. You also have the moon under her feet, and her head a crown of 12 stars. There's also, so you have kind of mentioned in the same breath this woman who gives birth, and the dragon, which I think that our tendency is to kind of interpret that as like, we think of Smaug, you know, or like a medieval dragon. But this is actually like, and I mean later on, spoiler alert, it might be even on in this chapter. Should have read ahead. The dragon kind of gets outed as being the serpent. So you have a woman and a serpent. Who does that make you think of? Eve. Yeah. So I think you have this allusion to Eve. You have the 12 stars, which I think Israel, I think that's right on. And then you also have the giving birth to a male son, Jesus. So we kind of have 3 women all wrapped up into one, right? If we consider kind of Israel to be, so like we have Eve, we have Israel, and we have Mary, kind of melded into a singular figure here. How does this vision help us to better understand where God is in the midst of the chaos and suffering that so often afflict his people?
It's a real light question.
What's that?
It's a real light question. Just
Right, yeah.
real
Yeah.
It's a softball.
softball right there, everybody.
Yeah. That one's from NT, right? That one wasn't mine. This is all
He's there.
He's there, yeah. And what is he doing? What's he doing for the male child?
He's protecting them.
Protecting. Yeah.
Well, it seems like he's protecting the woman too, because he prepared a place for the woman who fled into the
Yeah.
wilderness.
Yeah.
And that kind of seems like if it's Israel and if they were in the wilderness, like, you
Yeah,
know,
the wilderness is another big clue. there.
another kind of,
Yeah. We have 1,260 days, which I think is 3.5 years, which is, I think, an amount of time we've encountered before. Leslie says God is protecting her, right? He prepared a place for her to be nourished. Yeah. So God's protecting her, God's protecting her child. We get this image of kind of, I mean, I think to the Jewish readers here, they're seeing this kind of, mythologized version of Israel's history, right? Which is to say, salvation history, right? You have the promise to Eve that from her descendants one would come that would crush the head of the serpent. You have her kind of going into the wilderness and being protected by God. And then the promised child coming and the dragon trying to snatch it, but then it being protected by God and carried away. And so we have this kind of image of God's purposes, right, of salvation history being kind of played out in this little story.
I think it's interesting in that passage, though, also that there's no removal of the danger. So the dragon isn't stopped from trying to devour.
Right.
They're protected and taken away from the danger.
Right.
So, and I think that kind of speaks a lot to that history that you're talking about, where it's always a protection from the danger. The danger is always there. It's always present. There's always that conflict with the dragon, but
Right.
The dragon isn't defeated at this point. Just they're removed from.
Right, and that's a very good point. And it's also kind of a creative retelling of Israel's history, because if you'd have asked people what they thought of like the wilderness represents or what that carries with it, is that an image of God's protection? Like, was Israel's time in the wilderness, like, would they have said that they felt terribly protected, or would they have said they felt horribly exposed? You know, and lost and aimless and all those things. And yet, from, I think, the benefit of hindsight, we're able to look back on that story and say, no, God was doing something important. God was conveying something important about who he was. God was conveying something important about who Israel was and was to be to the nations. And that all kind of happened through and in the wilderness. And that goes for us too. Like, I think that often God's protection, God's sovereignty, God's providence comes to us in ways that don't feel terribly protective. They feel exposed and dangerous and wild, and yet God is good. That's very good. I like that a lot. Let's see, Howard says, I think that's how long the family was in Egypt. Oh, interesting. Like Jesus' family to escape Herod. Interesting. I maybe. I don't know. I'd have to look at that.
I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah.
I don't know how many years it was, but it was a hot minute. They were there.
Well, it would have been. Yeah. Maybe. Interesting. I don't know. I'd have to go look. Interesting thought, Leslie. Yeah. Let's keep reading. And war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought back, but they were defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. The great dragon was thrown down, the ancient serpent. See, there he is, serpent, yeah. I love this. You gotta appreciate it too, because like anytime in this book where something's like, hey, this means this, I'm like, oh, thank you very much. Yeah, the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven proclaiming, now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our comrades has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. But they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony, for they did not cling to life even in the face of death. Rejoice then, you heavens, and those who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, which is a little bit of foreshadowing. For the devil has come down to you with great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. So when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given the 2 wings of the great eagle, so that she could fly from the serpent into the wilderness, to her place where she is nourished for a time, and times, and half a time, which is to say, a year, 2 years, and half a year, which is 3.5 years again. We see again. That's a time, times, and half a time. Then from his mouth the serpent poured water like a river after the woman, to sweep her away with the flood. But the earth came to the help of the woman. It opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from its mouth. Then the dragon was angry with the woman, and went off to make war on the rest of her children, those who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus. Then the dragon took his stand on the sand of the seashore. Wild. Like, there's all this stuff going on. Anything in that just kind of jump out at you, like snag you? Does anything sound like another story in the Bible? I mean, I'm hearing this, what jumped out to me just now is this idea of a river coming out of, like water coming out of the dragon's mouth.
The flood?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a flood, right? I lost it. Where'd it go?
Verse 15.
Yeah, poured water like a river after the woman to sweep her away with the flood, but the earth came to the help of the woman. It opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from its mouth. So I mean, you have a flood and then protection. You also have kind of the earth, like this division of earth and water. That sounds a little bit like the Exodus, right? Like the earth coming to, the water being held back. Then the dragon was very angry with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her children.
I think about obviously this is talking about how Satan was in heaven and then thrown out. And so he was there, Adam and Eve, he was the serpent. So I mean, when Eve ate the apple, but sin was here because it was with Satan. So like you were saying, all the bad stuff, it's not taken away, but I think that's because it was here even before she ate the apple. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I mean, I think it's possible much in the same way, because so we often do read back onto Genesis, onto the serpent in that story, that was Satan, although that story never says that. It just says it's an animal, that it's crafty. But I think much the way that John here kind of is creatively and prophetically blending together the images of, these stories of both Eve and Israel and Mary, he's also kind of doing that with the dragon, the serpent, and Satan, right? Mm-hmm. Like he's kind of saying all of these different stories that we've told, right? I think we take for granted the fact the fact that because we have the Bible kind of assembled in a collection, that gives us a perspective of thinking of it as this one big story. But that's not how it existed in the minds of first and second century Jews that would be reading something like this. So he kind of has to do that work for them, right? He's saying all these different stories that we tell are actually a kind of mosaic telling of this one big story of God's purpose, how God is going to take what was broken originally and set it right through his son Jesus, right? Which was promised from the beginning. So by evoking Eve and telling this arc from Eve to Jesus, he's kind of paralyptically talking about the promise to Eve, right? He doesn't quote the promise to Eve, but the serpent, this is the promise, right? The serpent tricked you, and enmity will exist between you and your offspring and the serpent, but one day someone's going to come and crush the serpent's head, right? This is the cosmic anticipation of the world, that one day that will be broken and everything will be set right. And John is saying that story as a whole is coming through Jesus, right? That's one of the big points of Revelation, is that Jesus is the one that all this is happening through.
So,
Yes.
so does this kind of imply that the devil didn't get really revved up against the earth until after Jesus came? Like, does that make sense? 'Cause it says
Yeah. I mean, I think kind of a.
he was a lesser presence before, and now he's like.
Well, no, because I mean, I think that again, we're kind of, because we're blending stories, we're also kind of blending timelines too, right? Like the timelines of those stories. So it isn't to say that these things happened in this order, because here, after the birth of Jesus, we're talking about floods and crossing on dry land and all that stuff, right? We're getting allusions back to older stories. Again, I think this is kind of a creative, prophetic retelling of salvation history, and so things get a little muddied. It's one of those things where, you know, even the best of metaphors, if you tease them out too much, kind of don't hold water. But
I think he was really just trying to tie it back to, because he goes through like three different things. There, the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent, who was called the devil and Satan. So he like tries to tie all of those things together. So
right.
I'm making the point that the serpent that you remember from that story way back then, at the very beginning of this whole thing, the dragon is him, the devil and Satan is him. You know, that was him.
Right.
So he was, you know, there from the beginning, and this is sort of his influence throughout that whole story. So I don't know that it was like point in time for this as much as it was just kind of like trying to draw all those points back to that initial issue.
Sorry, I'm reading these comments. There's a whole little conversation happening here. Jessica asks, why do some translations not have Revelation verse 18? Good question. I don't know that about it. Does anybody know that?
I've seen that. I have a Bible that will sometimes like annotate that. It says, I guess there's, when they compile the Bibles together, there's different manuscripts they use. So sometimes some manuscripts omit a certain verse and some include it, or they'll change words.
Yeah. I think we could do a whole series on just, like, I'd be fascinated to really unpack kind of how the Bible that we have has come to us. Like, all of the ways that different versions of different manuscripts have been assembled and compared and contrasted, and how many kind of executive decisions have had to be made about how things are said and presented.
The NIV has it as chapter 1 of verse 1 of chapter 13.
Oh, interesting.
So it's still there. It's not in chapter 12. It's verse 1 of chapter 13.
Yeah. Jessica says the same thing. She says the NLT or NIT. She might be.
Yeah,
She might
NIV
be
as well, I think.
NIV. Yeah.
And those numbers were added much later. It really was-
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, those weren't in the original
Right,
manuscripts.
yeah, that's true.
So, fun thing that stuck out to me was that, like, I mean, the idea of a dragon is flying, right?
Well, so like again, we kind of read Smaug onto it.
Right, but the reason I say that is because, like, a lot of ancient cultures have the winged serpent, like in Mesoamerican cultures and like in Indian, like ancient Sanskrit, and like in Chinese, like ancient Mandarin and stuff like that. Like, so the winged serpent is a very common, like, mythical, but like the winged serpent as like a dragon, I think has been more. I think it comes from that. I think the Smaug in the medieval version of the dragon that we now know is because of that winged serpent idea.
Yeah.
Which is interpreted in like a lot of different cultures. So like, I almost wonder that if like the first century church might have already known that imagery, and he's almost like stating what they already know. Maybe not. I'm digging into something that probably has nothing to do with anything. But it just stuck out at me because
Yeah. Well,
the
how
winged serpent is a very common, like, creature that is in basically all mythologies.
Yeah.
And not that I'm saying this is mythology, but like, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
It's not strictly biblical. Like, it's
Right. No. Yeah.
all over
No. Yeah.
world
Every
histories.
culture has some kind of. It was NIV. Just to clarify. Yeah. So the way that it's been explained to me by Robbie, because I asked him about this, he said think less medieval dragon, think more like Chinese New Year dragon, like, you know, where it's kind of like a long ribbony snake.
Yeah, like, well, like Quetzalcoatl in like Mesoamerican culture is the same, it's described the same way as like that Chinese New Year dragon.
There you go.
So this winged serpent is a very common,
Yeah.
ancient, idea.
Mm-hmm. It's a water-breathing dragon. It spits out water. Note in this passage, did anyone else have something to contribute there before we move on? I won't step on anyone's line. Note in this passage, who is said to fight against the dragon in the heavenly war? So let's take a look at that. Who fought the dragon? Michael and his angels. Now, note who is given credit for the victory. Who is said to have overcome the dragon?
I use passive voice. They were defeated. Hard to tell. No, I'm kidding. I think it's probably the dragon and his angels, because the next line talks about them being thrown down.
But he's asking.
Yeah, but then later on it says,
So it's
then I heard a loud. Yeah, say again.
It's their comrades, so they mentioned, you know, that the accuser of our comrades has been thrown down. It was, verse 10, who accuses them night and day before our God. So that was the dragon that got thrown down. Then following that, but they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, for they did not cling to life even in the face of death.
Right. So who is that referring to?
So that would be those comrades, the fellowship of the
Yeah,
saints.
the believers, right? Like those who, the faithful, those who were slain. They've conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. Why do you think that is, right? Like Michael and his angels throw them down, but then it says they overcame by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony.
It goes back to chapters 2 and 3, though, because all of those promises for those who overcome, you know, what the promises are. And so this is kind of tying back to, so what does overcoming look like?
Yeah.
And I do remember Robbie in classes actually referring to this sort of jokingly to the pastoral crew as like the most already written for you sermon series ever. So, you know, the 3-point sermon.
Yeah.
There's 3 points in there that'll preach every time.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was I think that's kind of where he's going with that.
He was thrown down to the earth so that people of earth would be the ones that were coming, like the angels are of heaven.
Yeah. Oh, there you go. Yeah. So like, now he's our problem, right?
Well, Christ didn't come to save Michael and his angels, he came to save us.
There you go. Yeah.
It kind of like if we weren't the ones that defeated him, then
What's our point?
yeah, what's the point?
Yeah. No, exactly. Yeah, and that's kind of woe to those who've been, where does it say? Woe, there's a woe in here. Woe to the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you with great wrath because he knows his time is short. Yeah, he's a wounded animal, which somehow makes him more dangerous, right? He knows his time is short. Yeah, I do love that. I do think that those kind of 3 things there really do give us a picture of what, you know, what faithfulness looks like, right? Like how we view, I don't know, life and even spiritual warfare, right? Like how do we overcome? Well, we overcome by the blood of the Lamb, which is to say we don't, you know, that Jesus does. The word of our testimony, that we speak of what God has done, and by not loving our lives even unto death, right? By living these kind of cruciform lives, these lives of self-sacrifice and self-giving love. We see here that the decisive victory has been won, the accuser has been cast down, his days numbered. However, he is still able to make war on the children of the woman. What hope and strength does this chapter give us as we face the accusations of the serpent?
Oh, that we can overcome him by the blood of the Lamb.
Yeah. And kind of what Mike was saying before, like, it doesn't mean that we're out of Dodge, you know, it doesn't mean that, you know, there's still that woe there to the inhabitants of the earth. Because, you know, he knows his time is short, but like, we endure. I mean, I think, you know, when it's all said and done, Revelation is one of those books that is so hard to understand, but so important, because it is about, I mean, as we've kind of said over and over again, about living faithfully, even and especially against the dominant culture, when the dominant culture is, you know, beastly. You know, we're going to talk about the beast next week and all that that means. I'm looking forward to that.
There's a heavy insistence in there too, because, you know, the passage says that he accuses night and day before
Yeah.
him. So, you know, when it's asking here, you know, about the accuser and what strength the chapter gives us against the accusation, it kind of sets it up that way to start with, that it's just a consistent and constant accusation that's being posed to God.
Mm-hmm.
But then the follow-up is, you know, shortly after that is when the conquering occurs, which is not really something that they did specifically themselves, but they relied on the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony, and that they weren't so worried about their own lives that they were willing to give them up if it meant, you know, holding to what they believed. So.
Yeah. We really get kind of this image of, like, even while the dragon is still active and alive and present, we have this proclamation of victory, right? So kind of, it really gives to us this idea of this victory over evil, over Satan, as being now and real and like happening now, like it's a reality now, and not yet. Like there's still history to be played out, right? Like there's still this story to finish unfolding, like this now and not yet. Kind of like, that's kind of how we talk about the kingdom, right? When does God's kingdom come? Well, now. We believe that now, that God reigns now, that the earth belongs to God now. And we anticipate when that happens somehow more fully, more completely. When that's here and present and yet not fully realized. That's all I got. What do you guys got? This was, I told Robbie, I had made this this study guide, and I messaged him and I said, boy, I hope you have a lot of thoughts on Revelation 12, because N.T. Wright, on whom all the study guides we've used have been very heavily borrowing from his study guide on the book of Revelation. I said, N.T. Wright really didn't give me much to work with. And he said, well, funny you should mention, I actually am not going to be there that night, so I need you to talk about that.
So he didn't write a book about, Robbie didn't write a book on
Robbie did write a book on Revelation.
Well, he did, but he said it was heavy on 10 and 11, so not 12?
I guess.
Yeah.
I guess, yeah.
Bummer.
That was gonna be a subsequent writing.
Epilogue.
No, he actually was planning to write one out.
Oh. He really was, okay.
That was a joke.
Not a joke. He just hasn't gotten to it yet.
Yeah.
One of your initial questions when we started the evening was, you know, what have you learned the last couple of weeks? And I think it's not just in the last couple of weeks, but really just my daily walk with Christ in the last several years. It's just like I'm constantly reading this, and I just wish I had more historical context of what some of these things mean, right? I'm reading this and I'm like, there's clearly riddles in here, but to apply a modern understanding, I feel like I'm missing the point. I want to know what a time and times and half a time meant at that time to somebody who would read it in the first century, or
Right.
why is she clothed with the sun and the moon? Like the 12 stars I can understand, but I don't understand the sun and the moon. And I'm also having to like deprogram myself of like reading this and being like, well, the eagle's America clearly, and you know, like so yeah, so I'm like fighting in my head just reading this and in the last few weeks as well, just trying not to like apply all this modern stuff. It's just really doesn't do its service. Like it's really not what that was about. So, but it's also an unsatisfying answer. I'm like, I don't know what this means.
Yeah. Well, I think that kind of humility, like coming to the text with that kind of humility, is a victory unto itself. Like I think that we don't. I think that we do that often, not just with Revelation, but especially with Revelation, where we come to it with a lot of assumptions and kind of pre-programming, like you said. And I think even just kind of pausing and saying, I don't get this right away. Like that, at least, I think, creates oxygen for, for some real, study to happen. So, when they were kind of assembling the canon, right, like whoever they was, I guess this would have been one of the councils in like the 3rd century or whatever, like when they were like putting the Bible together and deciding what was going to be in and what was going to be out, there was a significant portion of that council that was like, we can't put Revelation in there. Like, no one knows what it means. And not so much that they just didn't know what it meant though, they also were suspicious of it because the Gnostics really loved Revelation, because they said, well, we understand what this means. And they were like, well, if the Gnostics love it, how great could it be? Right? Like, they were like very, very suspicious about it. So, and funny enough, how they arrived at a compromise, because there was one camp that wanted Revelation in there, but didn't want Hebrews, and the people who wanted Hebrews didn't want Revelation, and they were like, well, we'll compromise, let's include them both. And they were like, okay, cool. And that's how we got both of those there. But yeah, I think that, I think I said in one of the early weeks, like, if we had like if we had like a political cartoon, right, of like a donkey and an elephant wearing boxing gloves in a boxing ring, we would have it would require no work for us to understand what was trying to be conveyed by that image, right? We're talking about the kind of, pugilistic political world that we live in, right? That things are violent and it gets bloodthirsty out there. But 2,000 years from now, if someone picked that up, they'd have no idea what that means, right? And so there is a certain extent to which the audience that this was written for would have much better insight in what some of these symbols and numbers and things mean. And I think even just kind of that awareness that I'm 2,000 years removed from the people, the language, the geography, the customs, all of it, the art, the culture that this was intended to be read in. And so I have to acknowledge to a certain extent that I'm looking into my neighbor's yard. And what's in my neighbor's yard doesn't belong to me, but I can still learn from, Does that make sense? I don't know, that's not a good
I think it's more mythical, like you said, than the other books of the Bible. A lot of the other books are stories about what happened. Now, amazing things happen, but there weren't, serpents flying and you get fantastical that an animal or a snake talked to Eve. But other than that, and I guess growing up in the church, parting the Red Sea is just, amazing, but not multiple heads and those types of things. So I think the fact that it is kind of written in that style, you don't grow up hearing stories in that style in the church. You hear the other stories, and they're stories about people and things happen to people. And here we're talking about myths or beasts and lampstands and things are very, there's a word, they're given human characteristics.
Anthropomorphized?
Yeah, I just think it's very different in that way from anything. So it's probably easier to put, for Gnostics, outside people to say, well, this must be what it means, because there's not a historical thing. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, and I feel like to tag on to like what both of you guys are saying, what you were saying to Michaela, is like I think we have a tendency, especially like in our culture, to be like, well, they didn't know what that meant back then. They weren't nearly as smart, but no, they were. Like the human race, like yeah, we have developed technology and stuff, but like, does anybody really know how their phone works? This is built on like centuries of knowledge, and like really, like from like Newton, like this is built on centuries of knowledge, and so like. Back then, I think that they had a much more intimate idea of what, like, and like you said, maybe a lot of them probably were also like, we don't know what this means. Like, why you wanted it? And the Gnostics were like, we know. But like, I think that people closer to the text obviously have a very intimate knowledge of what is being said, because I think, like you were talking about, and like I had mentioned before, eagles were a sign of strength. Like, or they were also like like in Greek culture, they were like attributed to Zeus sometimes, and like so I think that a lot of like if you were Greek or if you were you know from another empire, even if you were coming to Christ, as many were, because they were spreading the gospel, like you probably would have had your own intimate knowledge of some of these imagery, like some of this imaging, like the serpent is such a common image in the ancient world that I think they probably would have understood it a whole lot more. And I think it is a disservice sometimes when we look at things through a modern lens. And like for instance, like Shakespeare, right? Just to throw in another plaything, like I can't help myself. It's timeless because it still applies to the human condition now. But back then, it was roaringly hilarious, and also incredibly political because of the time that it was written. And we can only appreciate it in hindsight.
Yeah, and it's lost on us, but
You guys are giving people way too much credit. Just so you know, I think this was probably written for the people who were like the smartest in the room. we still debate what modern literature symbolism
Yeah.
is. We
Yeah,
have
no, that's
classes
true.
on things that we are living through, and we don't get the symbolism. This
or
was not for us.
Tolkien, or like Tolkien, right? Was just a couple generations ago, and a lot of that stuff we don't. I mean, someone had to explain to me. Wizard of Oz. Baum wrote that. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Like if when someone sat down and actually said like the scarecrow means this, the Tin Man means this, and I went, oh, that makes a lot of sense. But it's lost on me because I'm a couple generations removed from when that was.
There's books being written right now that in 10 years we're all going to be in classes. So our kids are going to be in classes and there's, what do you think this author meant? And the author's going to be like, I don't know. What do you think it meant? Like, it's the symbolism and stuff like this. Sometimes I think it's really for certain groups. And this one would have taken the people who really knew the Old Testament really well and like also knew all the stuff about Jesus really well to understand. So I think it was probably kind of given to them first, like you and Robbie, and then disseminated to us.
No, I think,
the
but yeah. So I think you're onto something there, because that was even kind of the vibe of the Gnostics. Like Gnostics comes from the word gnosis, which means knowledge, and so they were a group of people that kind of thought that they had secret knowledge from God, right? Like, and there was this very kind of elitist vibe around them. And they loved Revelation because that kind of fed into this idea of like, well, we understand what it means, and if you were with it, you would understand what it means too. And that's part of the reason why Revelation kind of had a hard time getting into the Bible, is because of that specific thing.
So the biggest danger of the book of Revelation is kind of missing the point of the genre. And Robbie hit on that from the very beginning. So the genre is a specific type. You know, Daniel, the end of Daniel is written the same way, and there are other examples that weren't included in the canon that were also of the same apocalyptic literature. It's very similar to, there are rules to how you have a haiku. You have to have a specific sentence structure and all that. The symbolism is shared throughout that type of literature. The danger with Revelation is getting lost in the symbolism and missing the point.
Yeah.
And the point is literally the opening statement. It's the revelation or the revealing of Jesus Christ. So the whole point of the book from start to finish is about the history of sort of Jesus's influence and presence throughout history from the beginning. Before time began, he was there, and that was a sentiment in John's gospel as well. That the Word was God and the Word was with God. So that kind of carries that same sentiment forward into this.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the biggest danger is getting so excited in the symbolism that's used and getting lost in, I gotta nitpick what that means. It had, it had 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns, and so how does that work out? The math doesn't fit, because did he have 3 horns on one head and 2 horns on that one?
Yeah.
How does that divide? I don't know.
Do they all share the same number of horns?
Just one head with 10 horns and then 6 without. Like, how does that? And getting so lost in trying to, like you said, the Gnostics, trying to know every aspect of it, and missing the point that the whole picture is how Jesus was there from the beginning, how he was part of Israel's history despite his non-presence there, obviously, and that when he is introduced into the story, it sort of changes the whole dynamic in the battle against the serpent, the ancient one, who was also the devil, if you remember that guy. And I think that's really kind of where the crux is here, especially that.
And that all of this is one big call to be faithful, while all of, that's why I love this chapter. It kind of zooms out and says, hey, this is about how we have suffered and are suffering and will continue to suffer, and the call for us is to overcome by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of our testimony, and not loving our lives unto death. Like, that's the crux of the whole thing. And I think it's possible to take this with a few doses of salt, because it's possible to overplay it. But kind of much the way in the Gospels Jesus says that, like, he speaks in parables in order to kind of obscure, like to conceal, right? Which I always kind of took, like that, I found that late in life. I don't know how I missed that passage. I always assumed that Jesus taught in parables to make things simple to understand, but Jesus says, no, I want to make it harder to understand. And people think, it's said that Jesus did that so that he could kind of speak openly about, the Roman Empire and the ways of the world, and the violence that the people were experiencing, without being labeled as a revolutionary, right? And so it's possible John is writing this so deeply entrenched in the genre of apocalyptic literature that to prying eyes, right? Like if a Greek person picks it up and reads it and goes, weird, and then passes it on, right? They wouldn't get the meaning of it, that this is saying, no, the devil is the dragon, the empire is the beast, and the Lamb wages war against them. Like they are coming to war against that which is good and godly, and God is going to overcome it in the end. And so, it's kind of almost like codified language a little bit, like a secret code, for your eyes for Jewish eyes only kind of thing.
But
I don't want to overplay that. I'm not saying that's what it is, but I think the idea has some merit.
But to that point, Jesus' parables were understood to the point that he was crucified.
Right.
For the fact that they were like, this guy claims he's like Caesar. So, I do think that, I guess my point on all this is, I agree with Amy. I do think that, people who were probably, the Gnostics were like, we figured it out. But, I also think that, we, at least in my experience growing up in the church, and kind of like what Alan was talking about, I heard so much of just kind of this disdain for the first century church of they didn't know, they were dumb.
Well, yeah, and it's because of how we read it, right? The last 50, 60 years we've been reading Revelation as though it was written, and John had no idea what it was written for us now, and these symbols mean these things now, in this century, and so everyone for the last 2,000 years who's been reading Revelation was wasting their time because it wasn't for them, it's for now. And that's clearly that's not true, and that's not the case, and that's a little
it's a little arrogant.
It's a little arrogant, right?
Yeah.
It's a little superior of us to think that no one for the last 2,000 years has been reading this book and getting what it really means. Not the case. How are we on time? We got 10 minutes. Good stuff, though. I think it's I think it's important because of, like Mike was saying, the crux, the importance of it is, Dennis, sorry, I'm terrible at multitasking. Jesus was not convicted by the Romans, but by the religious leaders who understood exactly what he was saying. Yeah, no, that's true. That's a good point.
Yeah, but that's the thing, is they understood it, and then they took him to Pontius and all of them. So the Romans were like, what's this guy, huh? And the religious were like, no, for real.
Yeah.
So they got it.
Yeah,
didn't like
no,
it.
I mean,
I mean,
so,
typically
yeah,
understand his parables though, he literally said he was God. Like,
He
to
just-
their face, when
Yeah.
they asked him, are you the son of God? And he said, I am.
So then they went and tattled.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
like the Romans didn't do it, but like they executed whatever the religious wanted, the religious elite at that point wanted, because they got it and they were happy about it.
Yeah. No, I think people by and large either didn't understand what Jesus was saying, or when they thought they understood what Jesus was saying, they tried to kill him.
Yeah.
I mean, he escaped death a couple times before it finally stuck, but then it didn't stick. Spoiler.
Spoiler alert.
What other thoughts? Anything else? We got a few more minutes left. I'm enjoying this.
I know you all said don't get stuck on the symbolism, but seriously, 7 heads and 10 horns.
Yeah.
Is it 7 heads with 10 horns each?
Every third
Or is
head
it-
has 1/3 of a
Because that
has
was-
an
it
extra
70 or-
0.3.
I'm gonna look up 33 translations tonight. to get the answer.
We need the math.
horn or the head?
Right.
Yeah, so the head.
No, it's like Build-A-Bear.
Yeah, right. Because like you're like 7 heads. But wait, what's the distribution of the horns? Like, how did?
One day I drew the book Song of Solomon describes this Shunammite woman, and it uses all of these metaphors. And one day I drew like what that would look like in literal so there's like pools and doves for eyes, and then goats for teeth, and then a neck that's a palm tree, and it's just horrifying. And then actually, I'm not an artist, but I did it to be funny. And my friend who is an artist said, no, I'm gonna do that, and like did a whole series, and like did the beast and the dragon and the lamb and all of the angels and stuff. Which, I mean, hearing these descriptions of angels, no wonder they're having to go around all the time saying, fear not, right? Because, like, angels are like, fear not, but then also 10 eyes and horns and trumpets and bowls. Fear not, what are you so afraid of? All right, y'all. There's a handout in the back for next week. Grab it. Robbie will be back next week, thankfully, and I'm so enjoying this. I really do appreciate you all and your insights and all that.
That would be a fun art competition.
Yeah, that would.
Sure.
I don't draw, but I pay to see that.
I'll tell you what, I will put a gift card on the line. We can, if we want to do an art contest, pick any of the creatures from Revelation and draw it, and then on the last day of this series, we'll take a vote.
I feel like
And
I
we'll
was gonna
judge.
say, because draw a Song of Solomon sounds like a really bad idea to put up on the screen.
Yeah.
What kind of church is this?
Imagine that gallery of just like, and this is imagery from the Bible. Ah! So people are like, the Bible's boring. I'm like, is it though?
We'll replace the signs we had along here.
Yes. Yes. Yes, please.
Look
at other people. This is my kind of church.
What are they smoking here?
Robbie might like it, because instead of the calendar of the church, it would
Yeah.
just be Revelation all the time.
There you go.
It's like a really haunting church. Good Halloween. There you go.
There you
Oh,
go.
that's just
That should be,
Nothing
that'll
We
be the
should just
costume
replace it
contest.
this week before it gets back. That'll be our trick
Dress
or
up.
treat.
There you go.
That was your favorite Revelation imagery.
Yes. You're welcome.
I am the
Hey,
7 bowls or whatever.
Can you stay and take the kids home?
Just have a bunch
It,
of
it
on
makes
the
me,
lampstand.
this is so off. There was a show with the Venture Brothers. It was an animated show. Anyway, there's this one time where
No chair today.
this like, it's like a parody of like Uatu the Watcher from Marvel. Like shows up and he's like observing everything, but he's like so gigantic and loud that he's like, ignore me. You can't. And he's, like he pops up every once in a while. And he's like, pretend I'm not here. Ignore me. And everyone's like, gosh, I can hear your voice in my eyeballs. Stop. Like, that's an angel. Fear not.
Try.
Well, and like when you think about it, like when you, like I guess Lucifer is described as like
Yes.
an angel of light, like Satan is like a plumed serpent. Like that's actually pretty
Yeah.
compared to
Yeah.
the other imagery where it's like, and it was a light, and it was a fair,
I mean,
and it
even
was 10
like-
eyes.
Even like a dragon sounds better than some of the angels that they're describing. Like, whoa!
I don't wanna hear it.
Like,
It's funny today.
I'm not saying I prefer the dragon. I'm just saying, like, if I had to get one tattooed on me,
It was funny because today Audrey was asking.
I literally, I can't remember.
He gets real deep sometimes. Like, who created? Like, he's like, how big is the universe? And like, where does God live? And I'm trying to
Or like the
explain
other
to him like
morning
it's a
where I
spiritual
wanted to
realm and things like
use
that.
my
You're like,
arm,
what
I
are
just
angels?
know I
Like,
just
I'm
feel
like,
it.
well, some people. Some people.
She just straight like,
I'm not.
she sparted my side.
Some of them look like people.
that was me myself right there.
It makes
It was
me
like,
angry.
it was
So it's
angels,
like my
fear
one
not.
morning I need to sleep
Also
in, and I
angels.
wake up
And it was,
by
someone had
Must be nice.
taken their cat and put googly eyes all over it.
It's like, ah! Well, and it's like, it's funny, where did we get the imagery, like the Renaissance imagery of like little baby cupids?
Not from the Bible.
That's not,
Yeah.
that's not, that must be some like Greco-Roman something or other, because that was not.
Yeah, Cupid.
Cupid.
It's, yeah.
Yeah, that's a Cupid imagery, because like the angels in the Bible look nothing, they describe nothing like that.
Sure.
Yeah, so actually, I wasn't gonna bring this up, but just because I get real deep sometimes in like stuff, so, and etymology particularly. So, America, the name, a lot of people attribute it to Amerigo Vespucci, who was kind of a second-rate explorer. But, so some people say,
He was like Kirkland Bryant Columbus, right?
right, exactly. Great value, great value Columbus. So some people actually say that that is not true, that that was, a way to kind of bypass, or at least, for lack of a better word, Europeanize an actual native language. So there was I think it was an Inca word that was kind of passed throughout in America.
Is it 70?
That was Amaraku. Amaraku, so it's translated A-M-A-R. Basically like America, but like change out the E for the A, like, and the A for E.
Because it was like,
And that word
they were no longer doing it,
means
so yeah,
the
back when I
land
was
of the
like,
winged serpent.
Was that like a textbook?
it wasn't required text, I just,
The
I wanted it
etymology
because
of
he
it,
had
they
said
say,
something about
is
it.
the
And I also
god
had a
of
copy of
the
it.
west, and
But,
a
those-
god of light.
A lot of stuff.
So, yeah, so I during that I was like, oh, that would be a different interpretation if you
Yeah,
were to
exactly.
dig into that.
And I've read it probably like 2 or 3 times too, so like it's all like, and now I read it, it's so hard for me. I either have to read it like very like, I don't understand, I'm trying to understand, or like I start throwing in these things and I'm just like, no, that's not, but then I just don't.
Yeah,
it's just-
so like that
there's no-
serpent,
there's no
winged
answer.
serpent,
Yeah,
is
that's the
very
thing.
common thing.
Oh, I must have
in the
an
ancient world, but especially in the
There
Americas.
was a
Like
point,
Maya
because
Aztec.
my degree is actually a pastoral.
There are some people that
And I
think
did that for 6 years.
they took that, you're in the lie. Where's
But
the,
initially,
oh, this is
initially I was
Amara.
gonna actually pursue
This is Amara.
more advanced
And so
degree.
they were like, no, we're gonna take that. They were like, that guy.
Mine was specifically focused a bit more on
So,
the beast.
anyway, I sometimes, you know, put on your tinfoil
Like,
hat.
I did a ton of research on that, so that was kind of what turned me on to the whole thing. And that's actually why, the only reason I really knew that Robbie wanted to write on the woman and the dragon, because he had actually told me, and like, back when I was still in college, I admit it, but it was 2007.
Pre-pandemic,
Yeah, well,
time
yeah,
off
for me,
and
that's
stuff like
2008,
that.
that's when I graduated, so yeah, it started to be like,
I was actually
Super
going
interesting,
to
like, give me a book of
on
Enoch.
that
Well, I mean, wasn't that one
and then
also
we
like
kind of lost touch.
argued to be
After I moved back
canonized?
to Michigan, and I don't think he ever actually went that way, because he
It's a
started
huge
doing more
book. I didn't realize
the
that's a
ecology side of things. With the college,
like,
Right.
yeah, so mostly like, he started doing a lot of things like focused around the book of Revelation and the understanding that the end times don't necessarily mean the end of all things. So that we should actually be concerned about the environment and things.
I got you, okay, so you do need ecology. So I was
Yes.
like, ecology, that's
Yeah.
environment.
I know, and it seemed very odd to me that that was like the
Like,
book.
oh, it
and
should have been included, but
I
like.
kept
the book
getting
of
those
Enoch
manuscripts
actually
from
is,
him, so like I
another
actually have a
Bible.
digital copy of
Huge.
it.
It's like a
Because I did the indexes for him. And then it's like the deal that I made him was, I'll do the indexes for you if I get a free signed copy of it. And that's what he did, yeah. So I got an autographed copy from Robbie way back in the day when it published originally for
Well, I
his
mean,
dissertation.
David did some
Yeah, he kind of started doing a lot more of those things. I didn't believe he ever actually finished the direction you wanted to go with.
I wanna see how
the
big
dragon kind of
the lot
symbolism
is.
that was going on. 'Cause when we talked
I'm
about
not
tonight,
here.
with the heavy emphasis on
Yeah, yeah.
and kind of how that influences was actually a big part of what
Then I had to go.
just kind of try to
That's another one of those.
tease out a bit more. So,
Like, or just
Well,
like all
it's like the climate is.
like I said, I had spent a lot of time looking at the beast, you know, kind of what is that dragon? It's like you said,
They
the
also
symbolism
giants.
is always really casual.
And
It's
the
like,
flood.
why is this
Those are like the
so
three
important
major
that-
things,
and
creation
how
story,
every
flood,
time,
giants,
no matter who
and then a lot of them have.
there was some way to
like,
prove
serpents.
that that president was the beast, and that president was the
I
beast.
don't know, I think, like, I was listening to somebody, and I don't know exactly where they were, but it made me think of that, it's like, this idea of like, everybody thinks that we're.
Where either you just keep guessing wrong, but then I start hearing.
Because I just quit.
And I was like, oh, I have a point. But he was like, you know, we don't give a lot of credit to the people in the past. So these wonderful things that lived out their lives, because we think that they were. And I mean, yeah, some of them were illiterate peasants that didn't know, but like they had a much cultural connection to what was happening, and I don't know, I just think that they were.
Finally, it's due Friday, but I just was waiting Right, Greg Reese is gonna be there, gonna get me from the 1 year they made it, it's an IBC project.
Right.
They didn't last year, which was fantastic, but they have.
There's love in there, like, still lasts.
They kind of present on TV.
Service for like.
It lasts 50.
Yeah.
Yep.
There you go, there you go,
When I
yeah.
was at Ashland,
Yeah, I've seen Gretchen's posts about her
Yeah.
time that's lately.
But yeah, so she, so we went to, her niece's, some
water.
going on.
Salt.
And,
Butter stars.
yes, thank you. Yeah, so like, I grew back, so like, we
So
got the
now-
equivalent, okay, yeah, so, okay.
I was the weirdo who went to an AG church with an uncle and a grandpa who were both heavily Southern Baptist preachers.
Pastoring.
So
Yeah.
it's like,
Because
They were
again,
like,
we don't really be like, no, water.
we don't talk about, like, we're just very happy you're in the ministry.
Yeah.
We'll
Why would you
Why-
use
why would you
drinking
use
water?
our
Drinking
drinking
water.
water?
Why would you use that?
It
That's
doesn't
dumb.
lie.
No, that's what we're
Oh, you're, okay, it's like, okay, that's.
Yeah, it's like, it's not, why would they use it? They'd be like, no,
And then there's, like,
in the
some
water
talk
that's
about
readily available, you don't.
Yeah, that's not a real
Drinking
thing.
water.
There was a Washington game.
But yeah, yes, there was like, they were talking about like, I don't know, this is in context of what, I forgot how they connected the two, but like, but yeah, they were just talking about love and year, I was like, you know, it was kind of fun, like, talk about love and year.
Oh, that's awful.
It's actually just
Yeah,
awesome,
that was,
listening, some of the basics and also just attributing all this, and I just felt like,
There is
it's like I was like added deep purple on that.
I was like, great eagle.
Well, yeah, no, because, well, and like,
It
they
actually
probably
helped
have
taking
water,
some back
groundwater,
long time. When
that was my
Robbie
master's
did
in
his
water,
graduation
wastewater.
back
I actually really wanted to work in
take it.
wastewater.
I didn't need it.
But yeah,
I
no.
got all the
it's-
credit hours I needed, but I'm like, I want to
There's
take this.
different systems, but if you put it in like either anaerobic or aerobic, it actually.
I learned it a lot, and a
It's
lot of
really,
it
really
was
hot.
kind of covering.
That was making a joke.
It helped break that. Because like you said, I saw it back in the day. I saw all those things.
Yeah.
The drive-in theater that we had nearby. And so like, it scared the crap out of me, but I was absolutely convinced. Everything's on like a 7-year period, and so after that 7 years is done, this thing's gonna happen. If you can find that start point, you can map out the
But
exact
yeah, I
time
love
where
that.
this thing's gonna
Right,
happen.
that's where everybody's like trying to know, like,
Civilization and
this
stuff.
generation is gonna
I just think they're real smart, man. Like, I don't know how to make a wheel.
Way to define generation.
I don't know how to
Oh, it's gonna happen.
read a sundial.
I'm not gonna make it to like high school.
This is like,
And I totally understand that, because that's the way I grew up too. Like everything was very dispensational. So yeah, this was with the fact. So like having gone through that with him and actually realizing like maybe that wasn't the right way to look at this, and then kind of sitting down and saying, what is the scripture? What does everything say? So like I said, I spent a lot of time with 13. One of the things I noticed in there was something that Robbie, I'm sure, is going to, spoiler alert for next week, we're going to talk about this. The fact that numerology, 666, there's a variant reading of 616. Because, yeah, so we talk about manuscripts.
well, it's like
people
if
just
somebody
got-
from like 2,000 years from now, like,
and
saw
it's a mathematical equation. So this number plus this number plus this
because they
number,
had
sorry,
something
this
like
letter.
and they're all
no bird, you go through the nation.
But
And
why
like
are they
everything
like,
together,
oh,
you
you
get
could
the
use
number.
connected. But
So,
like,
Yeah,
or
it's
like,
a
copy of the
recipe.
manuscripts.
Because the rest of these don't say so.
It's 616.
well, and like also, the way to think about my pyramids is like, like they're actually not
So
cited.
they would actually update it that way. It's a minority.
Like there, if you look at from the top, there was a guy who like in the 1800s was like, no, there are 8 sides. And I'm like, you're crazy. And they're like, no, look at the angles. And they're like, you're nuts. But when
What
you
is
fly
that trying to say?
overhead,
Like,
you see
what
the
things might actually
indentation.
fit both?
So they're actually indented on all
There
four
are
sides.
definite
Actually.
possibilities in both of the seasons. Nero, Caesar.
So yeah, so
Probably the
so
most likely to
it's
be
crazy.
some
Like,
representation.
I think the people back
And some of the other seasons as well.
They had a lot of time too.
They had some.
We're like way too
One of the
distracted.
weirdest kind of things is the fact that it says us the number. And the number that is associated with the word man is actually equal to 666 or 616.
Okay.
So if you kind of, if you start and you go, let's sort of not think of this as a specific individual, which most likely is Nero Caesar. It was specifically about, but like, what was the first one of that? And then you look at, well, they're gonna take the mark on their hand, they're gonna take the mark on their forehead. You know, Robbie, I'm
So I've been
sure
doing this up here.
and then you're gonna tattoo on your hand or your head.
He was like, I'm the architect, I'm engineering this, it's fine.
Your ability to use it. That guy would just look at you and go,
I got it. This is fun. I gotta
And
go.
then like, on Amazon,
I mean, like,
Oh,
Love you all.
good man, how are you?
right.
you know,
it's getting harder.
that, yeah.
I kind of mentioned a couple weeks ago.
Terrible. Absolutely terrible.
They talk about.
I was looking good until the 4 o'clock games because I had Aaron Rodgers and Baker Mayfield and neither one of
Tell them
them.
about what happened here.
So
And in
it just
hearing it, it will be
ruined
like
my
the sign on
week.
the hand and the sign on their forehead.
Right, okay.
So
The building context of the saints.
Yep.
I,
Yeah, the sealing of the saints. Yeah. So the interesting thing there is that
I don't know if he's available. Yeah, Winston is really comfortable with his
this
type
marking of the
on the
hand,
Saints.
and
Yeah,
which really isn't so
oh
much
yeah,
about the physical
amazing.
mark.
But
Like,
yeah,
they weren't actually
so
it was hearing the word, absorbing it, and making it like.
Yeah, I mean, you stop back.
Yeah.
Not literally.
hey,
Yes, he's
you gotta do
consuming
the
it, he's
board.
making it kind of like part of it. And so
Oh, okay.
it's the same kind of concept with the Israelites. They would hear this and it would seal them because it would change who they are, it would change how they act, and it would cause them to act more in a godlike way. So if that's the case, it's not a literal mark on the hand of the forehead for God's people. It changes how they interact with people, how they treat people, how they feel about people. The antithesis of that would be a
Amy said you're not gonna be here
or
tomorrow.
the interpretation of your actions. So
Are you?
hands and forehead are always
Amy,
this
he's gonna be here.
actions that you do with your hands and the things that you
I
think.
thought Patty said you had the kids because that's.
So when you realize, like in the broader context of scripture, the hands and the forehead are always connected.
Sometimes people do that.
And then you realize that they've also talked in other parts of scripture about these signs, even in Revelation, that the things you think and do, either with your God or in the world can. And then you realize it's not so much about a specific man, it's about being mankind.
Yeah.
And so,
It makes more sense though, because it's in context and not having to like try to figure it out from like whatever scared me. I was like,
yeah.
I figured it out. No, I don't think.
Oh, yeah, free.
Right. But that's the thing, like that whole scenario, when it opens up like that and becomes a little less specific, it lets it kind of point back to what the whole point of it was in the first place, as opposed to, well, no, I have to figure out that thing, or I can't know how this whole thing works.
You know, really, now I'm thinking about like, because I went back and watched the
Let me
first,
tell you, because you're memorizing all
and,
the things right
Yeah, but that's not like.
yeah. Opening of like, this is about the relationship.
Yeah, that's what I thought, but now I'm looking at it, only now Troutman, but
Like, so let's dive in. The seventh church.
I'll try with that the same week. With 6 targets in week 1, he could be in a position to prove in week 2 against Carlos defense line. Oh no, you're like me, so
Read what John had to say.
that might stick with him.
I think we just overcomplicated it by trying to figure out all the details. That we missed that overarching theme that was just about Jesus and these things that are going on. The whole point of them isn't to count the number of heads and horns and all those things, but to kind of point out that there is this difference
Good job tonight.
between what's over here and you get to pick yourself. And ultimately, both sides are going to point back to the point of the book, which is the revelation of Jesus as the
Yeah.
coming Savior, the one on the white horse.
Yeah. I think a lot of us feel intimidated by
Hey, no.
still, just because, you know, it is.
No.
There's so much, but and I think a lot of times we make it harder than it should be. So.
Yeah, I was gonna say, are they?
Like when we were reading the beginning of chapter 12, like at Delania, like all I could think of is like Christmas story, you know, okay, you got Mary, you got Herod who wants to kill everybody and you send them away. And,
I'm a little less willing typically to assume that John the Revelator was actually kind of looking at New Testament writings.
Right.
Because that wasn't, canonized yet. They had brought those together, and whether or not he had been part of the group that had gotten that shared, because the letters would have been written and probably passed around while he was on the island.
Probably not, and this was like years later, like.
It's possible, but there certainly might not have overlapped either. Like, he might have been doing his own thing before he got there, so whether or not he's actually using letters. I do think there's clear allusions to Isaiah and Daniel. It's the same use of the there. But I've also found a lot of Torah. Like, there's a lot of allusions that get lost there. And the time that I actually brought up the whole link between Revelation and Exodus. Rob was like, I don't think I've ever read somebody make those connections. And I was like on a mission to go look and see, like, is that a common theme, or did I just kind of dream that up out of the air? Yeah, because that was the thing. They all learned the Torah, and then from there, whether or not they continue was kind of a decision that got made based on their aptitudes. So, yeah, everybody gets to learn it if you're right enough and showing up promise, then you can continue. And if you're not, you get to go on your family training.
Kind of trying to make sense of it. We have Jerusalem, hundreds of thousands of
got her, like,
and you know how do we make sense of all of that? And yeah,
she loves
I think
history and
just as
all
how
of those
Revelation
things.
probably was speaking to that experience,
But you learn
speaks
that,
to
I think, in
all of our
these differences.
experiences.
It's young. You know, in depth.
And I think too, sometimes because it's how it's presented to me too, because like I had a history class in high school and I couldn't stand history, but it was just the teacher.
Tired.
Boring, he was dry.
I think next week's gonna be crazy.
And there was nothing exciting
Next
about
week.
it at all.
Yeah.
No, my husband had somebody that like lived it.
Oh
yeah.
we're doing 13, 14, 15, and 16 in 1 week.
What?
Which is to say, we're not getting through all of that.
No, because I wrote a 14-page paper on book 15, chapter 15, so.
I think it's take calculus that I really like in college, because you just had to keep doing sciences.
Ugh.
And actually, I really don't even like sciences that much, but it's what I am.
Right.
My research topic.
Sciences are not. Well, when you get into like the